If you are a fan of Formula One from the late 70s to the early 2000s, you are probably very familiar with the Arrows team. If you count the team under both the names Arrows and Footwork, as they competed under from 1991 to 1996, they started in 392 Grand Prix from 1978 to 2002, spending pretty much all their time in the midfield or the back of the grid. Their 392 starts are the most of any team that never won a race, but they did achieve 9 podiums and 1 pole position. Mixed in with these races are some very strong drives, including a few in which that elusive win came tantalizingly close. Today we are going to look at what I consider to be the top 10 drives in the history of the Arrows Footwork team. Before getting into it though, if you enjoyed the video, please like and share the video and leave a comment, and if you want to see more similar content, then subscribe to the channel. Before starting my top 10, I did want to highlight a few Arrows drives which started off strong and at least had the potential to be considered for the top 10, but ended a bit too early for me to put them in contention for this list. So here are 5 of these drives. Riccardo Patrese, 1978 British Grand Prix. As we'll see going through this list, Riccardo Patrese and Arrows in their early days were a fairly strong combination and probably the strongest the team ever was in their history. Patrese qualified 5th for the race, which would match his best qualifying of the season, but would drop a place to 6th on the opening lap to the Williams of Alan Jones. As with many other races in 1978, it looked like the Lotus duo of Mario Andretti and Ronnie Peterson would run away with the race, but it would not last long with both drivers retiring early. This brought Patrese up to 4th, but in the middle of a battle for the lead when Jones, who was running 2nd, and Scheckter, who was leading, ran into trouble. This brought Patrese up to 2nd behind the Brabham of Niki Lauda, just short of half distance and with a legitimate chance to win the race. His run in 2nd would be short-lived though, as just 4 laps later Patrese suffered a puncture just after the pit lane entrance and had to do an entire lap with the puncture. The young Patrese then went around too quickly, damaging the car too much to return to the race. Carlos Reutemann, who was running behind Patrese at the time, would eventually pass Lauda and take the win. I'm not sure if Patrese actually would have been able to pull off a move and hold on to win himself, but I do think a podium this day was a definite possibility. Riccardo Patrese, 1981 U.S. Grand Prix West. The 1981 United States Grand Prix West at Long Beach was the season opener, and after a difficult 1980 season, Patrese took a shock pole by just 9 thousandths of a second over defending world champion Alan Jones for what would be the team's only ever pole. He took the lead at the start, and along with the 2 Williams of Reutemann and Jones, he began to pull away from the rest of the field. While Reutemann remained close, Patrese had enough of a gap in which he wasn't under immediate pressure, but as the laps got into the 20s of the 80-lap race, Reutemann drew in closer. Reutemann was now a direct threat for Patrice's lead, and on lap 25, Patrice's engine was beginning to misfire, and Reutemann made the move for the lead, followed by Jones a lap later. Patrese then came into the pits and retired from another race that Arrows at least potentially could have won. Aguri Suzuki, 1993 Belgian Grand Prix. You don't often think of Aguri Suzuki with superb drives, but at the 1993 Belgian Grand Prix, he looked like he had the potential for a fantastic result. He started the weekend by qualifying 6th, less than half a second off of Ayrton Senna, which would be the best qualifying position of his career. He ran 5th much of the race early on, and while he couldn't keep the pace of the 4 drivers in front of him, he was holding a small gap over Johnny Herbert, who was directly behind. By the time he made his first pit stop on lap 14, he was just a second over Herbert, but 14 seconds over J.J. Leto, who was running in 7th. Just a lap later, though, his gearbox failed, ending his day. It was an unfortunate ending for Suzuki for what could have been a rare points finish in 1993 for Footwork, and also his first points since he finished 6th at the 1991 U.S. Grand Prix. Pedro de la Rosa, 2000 Austrian Grand Prix. Pedro de la Rosa qualified 12th for the Austrian Grand Prix, but was able to move up to 4th on the opening lap after a chaotic start led to the retirement of 3 cars, including Michael Schumacher. After a brief safety car period, he passed Mika Salo for 3rd and would stay there for a while. The Ferrari of Rubens Barrichello would pass Salo for fourth a few laps later, and even though his car was slightly wounded from contact on the opening lap, he was still surprisingly having trouble keeping pace with De La Rosa. As the stint went on, though, Barrichello started to slowly rein in De La Rosa, and after 31 laps, he got the gap to under 3 seconds. However, the next lap, De La Rosa retired from the race with a gearbox issue. De La Rosa said afterwards they didn't need to pit for fuel until lap 37 of 72, so a one-stopper should have been possible. Barrichello didn't pit until lap 46, so I think he would have jumped De La Rosa at that point, but he likely would have been able to still finish fourth as a commanding best of the rest, which would have been a fantastic result for Arrows. Heinz-Harald Frentzen 2002 British Grand Prix. Arrows were on their last legs as a team by mid-2002, but at Silverstone, Heinz-Harald Frentzen gave them one last chance at a good result. He only started 16th and dropped a place at the start, but an early rain shower allowed him to be the first to pit for intermediate tires on lap 12. His Bridgestones were better in the wet than the Michelins many of the other drivers used, and Frentzen took advantage of them to climb through the field. After everyone pitted, he used his early stop to move up to 9th and continued making progress after that. Outside of the two Ferraris, Frentzen was as quick as anyone on the track and moved up to 7th by lap 20, but would have to retire at that point when his engine failed. The track would dry out as the race went on, so Frentzen's progress likely would have been slowed, but perhaps it could have still been enough to give Arrows one final points finish. Now that we looked at those 5 drives, we can get into what I consider to be the top 10 drives in Arrows footwork history. Number 10, Riccardo Patrese, 1978 Swedish Grand Prix. The 1978 Swedish Grand Prix was famous for the Brabham fan car which won in the hands of Niki Lauda, but it also featured a very strong drive from Patrese. He qualified 5th and then jumped to 4th at the start, and then turned that into 3rd when John Watson in the second Brabham fan car ran wide on the second lap. In the early stages, he had the Lotus of Ronnie Peterson pressuring him for 3rd, and on lap 10, Peterson did pass Patrese, but he quickly regained the position when Peterson had to pit with a puncture. He was then pressured by Watson, but that challenge went away when Patrese missed a gear shift and Watson spun to avoid him. Next was Alan Jones, who tried to pressure Patrese, and he eventually made a move to take the place, but immediately after the two touched, sending Jones into a spin while Patrese came away unharmed. Around the same time, Mario Andretti and the other Lotus retired from second, promoting Patrese to that position, but in the closing stages of the race, Peterson was once again pressuring him, having recovered from his puncture. For the last 10 laps, Peterson was doing everything he could to get by, but he couldn't do it, and Patrese held on to the position by just 1/10 of a second for Arrow's first podium. This race did feature a couple of ragged moments from Patrese, along with his defending, which came under fire from Peterson after the race, who was complaining he was weaving, so I kept it low on the list, but he did face a lot of pressure and did finish second behind the famous fan car. Number 9, Christian Fittipaldi, 1994 Monaco Grand Prix. Footwork posted some solid results early in the 1994 season, and while Fittipaldi's drive in Monaco would end early, it stood out to me more than the others that year. Fittipaldi qualified a career-best 6th for the race and moved up to 4th at the start. He was only behind Michael Schumacher and the Ferraris of Gerhard Berger and Jean Alesi, and surprisingly, he was able to keep pace with Alesi for a while and pulled away from the rest of the field except for the McLaren of Martin Brundle. Both Fittipaldi and Alesi made their first stop on lap 34, at which point Fittipaldi was still only 4 seconds behind, but after the stop he was right on his gearbox for a few laps before slowly dropping a couple of seconds back. However, on lap 48, Fittipaldi's gearbox failed and he was forced to retire. Brundle did jump Fittipaldi in the pit stop sequence, but Alesi ran into trouble after contact with the lap sim tech of David Brabham, so an unchallenged 4th was a very realistic possibility for Fittipaldi on the day, which would have matched his best career finish. Number 8, Jos Verstappen, 2000 Italian Grand Prix. Arrows performed well at some of the low downforce tracks in 2000, and at Monza the pair of De La Rosa and Verstappen had a solid qualifying at 10th and 11th. Incidents on the opening lap took out 7 cars, but Verstappen was one of them that survived and moved up to 8th after a long safety car period. The race restarted on lap 11, and he was able to quickly move up to 6th place within 2 laps. A few laps later, he passed both Giancarlo Fisichella and Ralf Schumacher, and along with the retirement of Jacques Villeneuve, he found himself in third. He was then in a battle for third with a surprising Riccardo Zonta and lost the place for a few laps, but Zonta pitted shortly after, returning the place to Verstappen. He held the place until he made his only stop on lap 32 and returned to the race in 7th, but once everyone else completed their stops, he returned to 4th, losing a place to Ralf Schumacher. He was only 4 seconds behind, but over the closing laps, the gap expanded to 7.5 seconds over the Williams. However, it was still good enough for a 4th place finish, which would be Arrow's best of the year, and coming close to threatening the Williams was still extremely strong for them in 2000. Number 7. Derek Warwick, 1988 Brazilian Grand Prix. Arrows had high hopes for the 1988 season, and while qualifying wasn't fantastic with Warwick starting 11th and Cheever 15th, Warwick put in a solid drive to give the team a bit of hope. Warwick gained a few places in the opening laps after some of the front runners ran into early trouble, and on lap 7 he had made it up to 7th. He then started gaining a few more as he stayed out, and some of the drivers in front of him pitted for tires, but then on lap 27 he made what would be his only stop of the race and dropped back to 7th. Shortly after halfway, though, many of the other drivers around Warwick made a second stop, eventually promoting him to 4th, but he had the Ferrari of Michele Alboreto quickly gaining on fresher tires, looking to steal the spot. Alboreto was gaining at a pace that it looked like he was going to be fighting for the place in the final laps, but Warwick was able to find just enough pace that at the end of the final lap he was able to hold on to it by just over a second. This gave Warwick and Arrows a solid 4th place to open the season, holding off the quicker Ferrari. Number 6. Eddie Cheever, 1989 Hungarian Grand Prix. The 1989 Hungarian Grand Prix is famous for Nigel Mansell's charge to a win from 12th on the grid, but a bit further down, Eddie Cheever had a pretty good drive as well. He started down in 16th and didn't make much progress in the early laps, but once the race settled down, he started to pick off a few positions and began lapping at a similar pace to the leaders. As the race approached halfway, many of the cars around Cheever pitted for new tires, including his teammate Warwick, but he was able to stay out and gain those positions and then continued to set similar lap times to those that had pitted. He made it up to 6th on lap 36 and then moved up to 4th following the retirements of Patrese and Berger. Even more surprising was the fact that he was gaining on Prost for the final podium position, and on lap 60 of 76, he was only 16 seconds off of Mansell for the lead. Prost even pitted for tires for the closing stages, promoting Cheever briefly to 3rd, but in the final laps his pace did finally start to drop off a bit. Thierry Boutsen passed him for 3rd, and on the final lap Prost caught and passed Cheever for 4th, leaving him to finish 5th. However, 16th to 5th at the Hungaroring and running well clear of everyone except Ferrari, McLaren, and Williams on a no-stopper was still a brilliant day. Number 5. Mika Salo, 1998 Monaco Grand Prix. Salo qualified 8th for Monaco in 1998, which would be Arrow's best qualifying of the year in a dry session, and was within half a second of Eddie Irvine's Ferrari for 7th, despite having to do so in the team's spare car, which was set up for Pedro Diniz. He remained there at the start, but during the race's early stages, he was having no problem staying within a couple of seconds of Irvine, and when a few others in front of him ran into trouble, he gained a few places. As the race was approaching halfway, he was up to 6th, but still not far behind Irvine. He then moved up some more when Michael Schumacher attempted an overtaking maneuver on Alex Wirtz that would end in tears for both drivers, and after everyone completed their pit stops, he found himself in 4th. Unfortunately, Irvine had been able to open the gap to about 15 seconds, but he didn't have any challenges behind and was able to take an outstanding 4th place over a minute clear of 5th place Jacques Villeneuve in a Williams, which would be the team's best finish of the season. Outside of the Belgian Grand Prix, which featured a couple of safety car periods, it would also be the only time an Arrows would finish on the lead lap all year. Despite the solid result, Salo was left a bit disappointed as he felt had qualifying gone normally then he would have finished on the podium. Number 4. Jos Verstappen, 1996 Argentine Grand Prix. 1996 was the last year the team was named Footwork, and despite the difficult year, Verstappen gave the team a brilliant drive in Argentina. He qualified 7th despite being slightly down in revs during the qualifying session, ahead of both McLarens and the Ferrari of Eddie Irvine, which would be by far the team's best qualifying of the season as their next best result was 12th. He remained there at the start, but lost a place a few laps in to Jacques Villeneuve, who had gotten off to a poor start. He was then pressuring the Jordan of Rubens Barrichello early on, but 12 laps in, he ran off track, briefly dropping to 11th. He would recover from it, however, and on lap 33 he made his way back up to 7th, and during the final pit stop sequence he ran as high as 5th. After the final pit stop sequence, though, he found himself in 9th but started to make moves. He passed the Ligier of Panis and then caught and passed Coulthard's McLaren for 6th, as he had also gained a position when Gerhard Berger retired. He then closed in on Irvine's Ferrari and caught him on the final lap when Irvine's car became stuck in 6th gear. Verstappen made a move by but ran wide and gave the position back, but he still held on for 6th for what would be Footwork's only point of the year. The result probably would have been a bit better had he not had a couple offs during the race, but to still be competing with cars from Ferrari and McLaren in the low-budget Footwork was an extraordinary result for Verstappen and the team. Number 3. Riccardo Patrese, 1978 South African Grand Prix. Arrows debuted at the 1978 Brazilian Grand Prix with a 10th place finish by Riccardo Patrese, and then at their second race in South Africa, they looked like they were going to be a force to be reckoned with. Patrese qualified the car a solid 7th and moved up to 6th on the opening lap of the race. He then very quickly passed the Renault of Jean-Pierre Jabouille and then moved up to 4th when James Hunt retired and settled into 4th for the opening laps. Many drivers were struggling with overheating tires early on, and with Patrese being less affected, he moved past Niki Lauda for 3rd on lap 19, and then 2 laps later passed Mario Andretti for 2nd, and was still right on the gearbox of race leader Jody Scheckter. After sitting behind Scheckter for a few laps, he made a pass to move into the lead on lap 27 of the 78-lap race. From this point on, Patrese eased out to a convincing lead and looked like he would be able to win unchallenged in a shock victory for both himself and Arrows. However, with 15 laps to go and with a lead of about 14 seconds, Patrese's engine blew, costing him the win. He said oil, water, everything was perfect. I just changed up from 2nd gear to 3rd and the engine goes bang. With such a strong performance in just their second race, it would seem like such a surprise that the team would go on to compete for 26 years and never actually win a race, and on just a couple of other occasions even get as close as they did that day. Number 2. Derek Warwick, 1989 Canadian Grand Prix. By 1989, Arrows was not as competitive as they were in their debut season in 1978, which made it a bigger shock to see Derek Warwick run as high as he did in the Canadian Grand Prix. He qualified a solid 12th, but rain on Sunday made for an interesting race. Conditions were mixed at the start with a drying track, but rain soon returning caused some of the front-running cars to pit for slicks and then pit again for wets. Warwick was not one of them and stayed on the wet tires he started the race on and used this to his advantage, and on lap 21 he moved into 2nd position following a pit stop by Ayrton Senna. At this point he was 28 seconds off the lead from Riccardo Patrese, but as conditions worsened, Warwick became the fastest driver on the track except for Senna and was eating into Patrese's lead by 2 to 4 seconds each lap. On lap 34, Warwick had the gap down to 12 seconds and Patrese pitted to surrender their lead, leaving Arrows to lead their first lap since the 1981 U.S. Grand Prix West. The lead wouldn't last long though, as Senna was still flying, and 4 laps later Senna went by, dropping Warwick back to 2nd. Unfortunately, just 2 laps later, Warwick's engine died, ending any chance of a fantastic result. Senna would retire from the lead late, while the Williams drivers Boutsen and Patrese would finish 1-2. Depending on how Warwick worked his strategy, just maybe he could have mixed it with them for the win to give both himself and the team a well-deserved win. At worst, he surely would have at least finished on the podium in 3rd, assuming he kept the car pointing in the right direction. Number 1. Damon Hill, 1997 Hungarian Grand Prix. Many of you will probably not be surprised by my selection for number 1 on this list, as it is probably the most famous drive in Arrows history and also one of the most famous near misses in Formula One history. After defending world champion Damon Hill was let go by Williams at the end of 1996, he ended up at Arrows in 1997 and had a disappointing year for the first half of the season. By the time he arrived at Hungary for round 11 of the 17-race season, he had only scored a single point but had a fantastic start to his weekend. His best qualifying of the season to date was ninth, so it was a shock to see him qualify third, which was also just the second time an Arrows had qualified in the top three in team history. He then had a fantastic start, moving ahead of the Williams of Jacques Villeneuve, and even had a look at Michael Schumacher for the lead into the first corner but settled into second. Hill remained right behind Schumacher, looking like he was quicker, and as Schumacher's pace started to drop off, Hill made a bold move into the first corner for the lead on lap 11. From this point on, Hill took advantage of his Bridgestone tires, opposed to the Goodyears of many of his rivals, which worked fantastically on the circuit and opened up a gap on the field, only relinquishing the lead during the first pit stop sequence. With 5 laps to go, Hill's lead had expanded to 35 seconds, and it surely looked like after many tries, Arrows would finally break through for their maiden win. This, however, was when disaster would strike. For the last 3 laps, Hill suffered from a hydraulic issue which caused him to be stuck in third gear along with an intermittent throttle, allowing Villeneuve to take massive chunks out of his lead. Villeneuve gained 10 seconds on lap 75 and 20 seconds on lap 76, bringing him within 3 seconds within Hill for the final lap. It was inevitable at this point that Villeneuve would take the lead on the last lap, and that is exactly what happened, but Hill was at least fortunately able to hold on to second for what would be Arrow's last podium. As you can see, despite the lack of success, Arrows did have their share of strong drives which led to good results, and if things fell correctly, there were multiple races in which they could have won. Hopefully you enjoyed the list and let me know what you think. Which drive do you consider to be the best in Arrows history, and were there any that you think should have made the top 10? Thanks for watching.